thing about GDRs is that it begins with the premise that this is a global emergency. The blue line here is our friend, the global emergency reduction trajectory that gives us an 80% reduction of emissions reductions by 2050. This is just to set the stage. Now consider this. Consider the 90% emissions reductions by 2050 target that Al Gore has suggested for the United States. Now let's imagine that all the current Annex I countries reduce to that same degree. That is the North's emissions reduction. Now, by subtraction, this is what's left. We call this the South's development pattern. This is not a statement about how much emission space the South should have. This is a statement about how much emission space the South does have. If the North was to reduce its emissions by more than 100%, this curve would be a little bit less restrictive. But the point that should be obvious, very briefly looking at this slide, is that it's not a lovely situation for the developing world. But then nevertheless, if you accept the need for an emergency reduction trajectory, that's what you have. So the question which we try to answer in Greenhouse Development Rights is this question. What kind of a climate regime can enable this to happen in the midst of a development crisis? And this really is the key, because there is a terrible, terrible development crisis going on in the world at the same time as the climate crisis. There are 2 billion people without access to clean cooking fuels, 1.5 billion people without electricity, 1 billion people with inadequate access to fresh water, and that number is likely to increase quite radically as the climate crisis it comes upon us. Tremendous chronic malnourishment, 2 million children dying a year from diarrhea, the AIDS crisis, and all the rest of it. I mean, obviously, we could go on and on, but the point is that very, very extreme reduction in global emissions must occur at the same time that the development crisis pretty much determines the conditions of existence for most of the people on the planet. So, in that context, how do you get a handle on the situation? How do you move forward? We tried to answer this question by sort of returning to the first principles. And so, very, very briefly, here are the key concepts that the Greenhouse Development Rights Framework, GDRs, is built of. First, it asserts a development threshold. And by a development threshold, we do not mean a poverty line of $1 or $2 a day. But rather, we define the development threshold as the minimum level of welfare to which everyone should be entitled. And we define it at a level where there would no longer be a problem of critical, crushing poverty. And in fact, we define it empirically at $25 a day, or about $9,000 per person per year. And we say that national obligations should be assigned progressively in the sense of a progressive income tax. That is to say, that no country should be required to have any climate obligation that corresponds to the income below, to individual income below the development threshold. Other people, who we sometimes call the global consuming class, and this is regardless of whether they live in the North or the South, who have incomes and emissions above the threshold, should pay for the costs of mitigation and adaptation in some sort of progressive fashion. So, what this allows people below the development threshold to do is to prioritize development. It's really quite as simple as that. And that is to say that in the first instance, a just climate regime, a regime that protects the right to development, must not saddle the poor and the innocent with obligations to pay for the emergency program of adaptation and mitigation. This is actually quite a weak definition of the right to development, but it's a kind of operationalization of that right, which we think is possible within the climate regime and justified within the climate regime. It's kind of a Hippocratic oath, a Hippocratic version of climate policy. The idea is that whatever else happens in the climate regime, it should first do no harm. It should shield the poor from the costs of action. So, to make this more concrete, we define obligation as the national share of global adaptation and mitigation burdens. That's pretty straightforward. And we define obligation in terms of capacity and responsibility. This is, of course, harkening back to the official UN text. Capacity is basically wealth, financial wherewithal to deal with the climate problem, and it's defined in a way that excludes income below the developing threshold, because we're not going to put any additional burden on the poor. And then responsibility is contribution to the climate problem, and we define it in a way that excludes subsistence emissions, that is to say, emissions corresponding to consumption below the development threshold. It's all very, very straightforward, very, very consistent with the official framework that this entire process is embedded within. What does this mean in practice? Now here's where the magic happens, right? Here are three important countries, and these curves represent reasonable approximations of the income distributions within these three countries. Each chart arrays people from the poorest to the richest members of these three countries. And that line, that horizontal line across the bottom, is the development threshold. And in green is the proportion of the income in that country above the development threshold. So note, for example, this tiny little sliver of green on the India chart, which represents India's capacity as we have defined it, which is quite small because only about 4% of India's population is above the development threshold. In China, about 22% of the population is above the development threshold. And as you can see in the United States, about 95% of the population is above the development threshold. It's actually notable as an American that the entire American population is not above the development threshold, even though it's a fantastically rich country. Clearly, so that in a nutshell is the definition of capacity. We need to note in this context that as a political matter, it's unlikely that the working consensus to pay this large part of the total mitigation and adaptation burden, I'm talking of the United States now, is unlike, such a consensus is unlikely to ever emerge if, in the United States, if the wealthy people in other countries are not similarly obligated to pay for adaptation and mitigation. So really, what the GDR's approach is an attempt to allocate burdens to nations in a way that's sensitive to their internal income distributions. It opens the box of the nation, even though this, in many ways, is taboo within this process. This is obviously much more complicated than I've suggested in these brief remarks, and in fact, I'm going to switch over. I'm going to skip over responsibility altogether. There's a similar analysis with responsibility, and I'm going to just skip it because I don't have enough time. And I'm going to just show you the bottom line that we've calculated using our indicative calculations. Obligations, again, are calculated as a sensible combination of capacity and responsibility. You know, something like the mean, for example. There are lots of possibilities. The United States, as you can see, has 31.8% of the global capacity to pay, according to the definition that we have laid out here. And Europe has, it's about a third, The EU has, about 3/10. You'll notice that China's capacity to pay is non-trivial, though quite small in per capita terms, and that India's is trivial, less than 1%. Similarly, for responsibility, the numbers are not surprising. And similarly, when you aggregate capacity and responsibility together to calculate a national obligation, you see pretty much what you would expect. The United States has a third of the total obligation. The EU has about a quarter. China has about 7%. India has about 0.3%. Obviously we drill down on this a lot, but really the question is, what does all this mean? You'll notice that I haven't said a thing about annexes. There are no annexes in greenhouse development rights. The other thing I should say very briefly about GDRs is that we sometimes call it a reference framework. We're not actually suggesting that the negotiators try to operationalize this in the next couple of years. We do think it would be a good idea. But we're just saying that it's an interesting way to look at the situation, and particularly because we're all so depressed and being overcome by a sense of crushing ennui and hopelessness. This is the global mitigation burden. This is an important slide because what greenhouse development rights does is calculate the percentage of the global obligation that each country is responsible for. There's a separate question, which is how large is that obligation, right? The top of the green wedge is the A1B, the IPCC's A1B scenario. That's our BAU trajectory. The blue wedge at the bottom is our emergency trajectory. As you see, there's quite a sharp disjunction between an emergency emissions reduction trajectory and even the relatively benign A1B BAU trajectory in the next 20 years. This is because really global emissions must peak very, very soon. The green wedge, is no regrets, things like energy efficiency, the stuff that saves you money and really isn't any burden at all. The red wedge is the real work. That's the work that has to be done, okay? Requires finance and technologies. This is the burden to be shared. We distribute this burden according to the allocations computed on the basis of responsibility and capacity in the preceding slides. It looks sort of like this, right? The U.S. wedge, which is shown up in light yellow, is slightly more than a third of the total emissions reductions that are necessary. The EU's wedge, shown in red, is about a quarter. China's obligation is non-trivial, which is to say that it's visible. It's that little green slice. India's obligations are not even visible. Note that adaptation requirements, which might actually be larger than mitigation requirements, would be allocated in exactly the same way. That is to say, in exactly the same proportion. Institutionally, the allocation would have to be completely different. In one sense, so there it is, really, really fast. That's GDRs. It's not really that complicated. It makes a lot of moral sense. The question is what kind of political sense it makes. And so even though this is in one sense the end of the story, I want to make a couple more comments about politics, political implications. I have 2 more slides. This is what it means for the United States. Okay, this is the United States' obligation wedges chart, as we call it. Okay, and as you can see, the United States is required to make very, very major adjustments very, very soon. The green reduction wedge is no regrets. The yellow wedge represents an aggressive program of domestic reduction policies taken here to be, the 90% by 2050 trajectory advocated by by Gore for A1 and other people other than Gore as well. But you would have it. If you listen to many people from Annex 1 countries, that would seem to be the total Annex 1 commitment. But in fact, there's also the orange wedge, right? The orange wedge, the one that says 5.6 gigatons of carbon, is the rest of the United States' reduction obligation as calculated by our indicative cases. It's a reminder that the U.S. obligation is above and beyond what the United States can arithmetically accomplish domestically. It is accomplished by enabling, via technology and financial transfers, reductions in other countries, China, India, wherever, where mitigation opportunities are greater than the national obligation. It's labeled here an international mitigation obligation, but it should be noted that if the United States could make greater physical reductions, the need for international reductions would correspondingly decrease. 2 key points. Were we to extend this chart beyond 2025, the implications of this analysis would become even more painfully clear. As it is, you can already see that the U.S.'s obligations very quickly come to exceed its total domestic emissions. This is the key point, for it shows that it's too late for approaches to global burden sharing that define equity in terms of emissions equity. GDRs assigns reduction obligations, not emissions entitlements. This is the key point. The other thing is, okay, so the last slide, final comments. Large north-south transfers, both technology and finance, are unavoidable. 2, this is not realistic, not today in any case. But we argue that something like greenhouse development rights will have to be in the package that goes along with the emissions reductions, targets, trajectories, and that are going to be necessary in order to stabilize the climate and prevent a climate emergency. So it's a tremendous negotiational problem, obviously. And that the alternative to solving this negotiational problem is like this, is a weak regime with little chance of preventing catastrophic climate change. So in other words, we can't negotiate with the climate system, so we have to negotiate with each other. And finally, that this is, even though we argue at length, and we think quite coherently that this is fair, it's not fundamentally being put forward as because it's fair. We also think that it's realistic. This is about politics. It's not about virtue. This is what's necessary in order to break the global climate impasse. So I think I've spoken to the question.